Morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It's just on 11 o'clock, so I think we have most people on, so we'll start. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christelle Rinn, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at HRLocker. So today we will be talking about the upcoming auto-enrolment that'll be coming into Irish legislation in 2025. And thankfully, I will not be speaking on this topic, and we have two experts here today who are speaking on the topic. First of all, we have Rob Nolan with us today. So Rob, thank you so much for being with us today from Corporate HR Ireland. So if you want to just give us...
Rob Nolan, Corporate HR. I suppose we're a HR company and we provide support to employers across a wide variety of areas, and we're quite a flexible company, so we try and work with employers to see what can help them best. So that's sort of us in an absolute nutshell. A little bit short, but there you are.
That's perfect. And we also have David Quinn with us today. So Dave, if you want to give us an update of yourself as well, an overview of yourself.
I am a financial planner and managing director of Investwise Financial Planning, and we advise corporates and clients on their pension needs alongside all their general financial planning needs. So we're a holistic firm.
Brilliant. So I'm going to just flip over to the next slide here, and I am going to just go through the agenda for the day. We just have a quick question there: is how long will the webinar be for? So the webinar will probably go through around 30 minutes for the slides, and then we'll go into questions and answers afterwards. So we'll be going through what is auto-enrolment, what can employers expect, what your responsibilities will be, the key timelines and deadlines, what we know so far. These might change as we go, how they may affect your existing pension plans, and then also alternatives. So Dave will go through some alternatives of the auto-enrolment, maybe setting up your own pension schemes and things like that, and any advice for both employers and employees moving forward. As always, we have questions and answers throughout. I have Nikki with me today, so if at any time you have any questions, please drop them in. So we're going to move on to, I suppose, what is auto-enrolment? And rather than, I suppose, me talking about this, Rob, I'm going to put you over, and you can I suppose give us an overview of what auto-enrolment is, specifically from an Irish perspective. Obviously, it's been into the UK, but from an Irish perspective, what does it look like? And I suppose what are we looking for into the future?
Yeah, and I suppose, look, this has come about because it's a numbers game at the end of the day, and I suppose at the moment what we have is about 6 people working for every 1 person retired, and what the government are looking at is in the next 20 to 30 years that number will change from like a 6 to 1 to maybe even as low as a 2 to 1. So I suppose in essence that places issues on various sort of social welfare systems, and as a way around that, you have 2 options effectively. You can increase your tax take, or you can look at something like an auto-enrolment system and sort of more or less force people into a pension scheme. And I suppose that's where that's the genesis of this thing, that we need to start planning for this thing now and need to start making people take control of these matters. Pensions themselves, fairly low take-up rate across the country. We have PRSAs in for probably the better part of 20 years. We're still probably only looking at about 50% coverage, so that's poor. An interesting statistic over the weekend said that 21% of people had no financial planning done for their retirement at all, which is quite worrying. So I suppose that's the basics behind it. What the legislation is basically setting up a whole system that will force employees to put money into a pension scheme. It will force employers to put money into a pension scheme, and there will be some tax relief for the company as well. So effectively the government will add a little bit of something to it as well. And the idea is basically to increase the pensions coverage, give people options about how they look after themselves when they get to retirement ages. And it starts off at a very low base. The idea is it will only start off at something as low as 1.5%. That is due to come in next year. Employer will have to contribute 1.5%, employee will have to contribute 1.5%, and the government then will have a contribution of half of 1% as well. So from that perspective, that'll get the ball rolling. And if you look at very simple numbers, if you take a salary of 500 quid, it means there'll be 750 going in from the employer, 750 going in from the employee, and about 250 going in from the government then as well. So I think it's fairly obvious what they're trying to do here is to try and get people to become interested and to get signed up for this thing and to get used to it. But I think one of the things they have is really the communication around this thing hasn't been particularly brilliant yet. And as we know, this will increase every 3 years. So 1.5, 3, 4.5, up to all the way up to 6 after about 10 years. And I suppose that's really going to be where it'll stop. Employees will have options of putting in additional voluntary contributions. It's a bit like the PRSA scheme in that it follows the employee. So from that point of view, it's quite useful. It's a little bit different to UK, where the model is at the moment, whatever company you're in, that's the pension scheme you put into. Whereas the Irish model will more or less say, look, there's your pension scheme. You put money into it. Your employer puts money into it. But if you move employer, it follows you around.
Yeah, and I think that's that you touched on two very key points there, Rob, is that so communication has been a little bit poor in regards to what's coming down the line. We're in almost the end of September at the moment, so hopefully we'll know something more by the time it's supposed to come into effect in January. In terms of the 1.5% coming out from the employer and the employee, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it probably will be coming automatically out of people's pensions. It isn't something that, out of people's wages. It isn't something that employers are going to have to take the 1.5% and send it off to the pension company, right?
Yeah, and I suppose that could be an interesting point as the numbers begin to creep up in this thing. I think most employees will probably accept that they'll be paying in 1.5% for themselves, and that will be increasing. It will be interesting to see what happens though when certainly with cost of living and cost of housing and many other pressures on people's wages. Will employees start sort of looking for employers to make their contribution as well? Look, obviously it's a question that doesn't have an answer yet, but I think it is. It's going to be an interesting question as we move forward.
Yes, and I suppose, Dave, what might be a good time for you to come into this, because we have a couple of questions that are saying if you have a personal pension, do you automatically enroll into this auto-enrolment by the employer? And my understanding, Dave, is no, because that is you already have a pension scheme set up.
Yeah, so you can opt out of this auto-enrolment scheme, but just to kind of clarify, the employer has to make a contribution. If the employee signs up to it, it's 1.5% employee and 1.5% employer. That's not an optional thing, and it is a fixed rate. You can't do more or less than that. But the employee can opt out if they have their own personal pension scheme, and they're making a decent contribution to it. And I think a lot of people will do that if they're higher tax rate payers, because the tax relief on this scheme is 33%. So if you're paying tax at the top rate, you'll be losing out by going into this scheme rather than your own personal one or an existing occupational pension scheme.
Yeah, and that's actually a good question here, and we're actually going to go into it in a bit more detail as we go through the slides. But the question is, so are we saying there's only one pension provider for the auto-enrolment that the government is going to sign up everyone up to? So Rob, that is my understanding, is that right now it will be kind of managed through a portal, somewhat like your PAYE. Anytime that the government will be, I'm not sure, you might not know this either, they've put a tender out to take one provider on, and it'll be one provider.
And they've selected that provider. That provider is actually the current provider of the auto-enrolment in the UK. And I suppose that makes an awful lot of sense. The simplicity it's going to bring with it. The system is there. Yes, it will need some tweaks for the Irish market, but they have selected one. So that's a positive, I suppose. Their next challenge will be then to start getting the message out there and to start linking that system then to payroll so that they can talk to these things. Because as Dave says, the contributions need to be made. So that'll be the sort of next step with these things.
And Dave, I think you just asked this question, which I glazed over when you're talking about gross and net and all that kind of stuff. But is the contribution based on the employee's gross wages or net wages? So this is where it differs a little bit from the tax relief from a pension perspective, isn't it?
So it'll be 1.5% of gross pay, up to a cap of 80,000. So if anyone's lucky enough to be making more than 80 grand, the extra isn't included, so it's the maximum of that's about 1,200 quid a year, I think, for an 80,000 euro employee, but it's off the gross pay. So in someone's pay slip, they'll see 1,000 a month less 1.5% gross pension contribution, and then they'll get taxed on the net amount. Or and it might be on top of their pay. It depends on how the payroll is managed for them, and then they'll see the employer contribution on the right hand side of the payslip, but it won't affect their net take home pay.
Yeah. So Rob, just a couple of questions for you. So my understanding is the government will release a portal that the employee will go into and either opt in or opt out. The opt out, they will be a little bit different from, the opting in is a little bit different from probably a lot of companies' pension schemes at the moment, where pension might not kick in until after 6 months, where this is on day one of employment, right?
Yeah, and I suppose, look, employees, that's effectively what will happen. You will have the option of leaving it, but I think the idea behind the scheme is that you're staying it for a while to see if you get sort of accustomed to it. So I think that's the idea, that's the push on it, that, you get into it and then you can leave, but you've had to make some contributions prior to that point to see if, you can live with that. And I think ultimately what the government are hoping is that you'll continue on because, it's a pension contribution. You're hopefully not noticing it that much, and therefore you'll just maintain it rather than they take the opt-out option.
Yes, I think I compared it recently to, it's kind of like a Netflix subscription that you forget about it after a while.
yeah, not unlike, yes.
So they make you do it, and then hopefully you just forget about it and keep doing it forever.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the essence. And look, let's be honest, that's probably elements of what pensions always have been about, that,
Yes.
for your own sense. And I think ultimately part of the communication is going to be trying to get across to everyone that there is a long-term benefit to these things. Like David will be able to elicit this far better than I, but the sooner it starts, the sooner you make a big difference, and the longer you keep doing it, the better it is for you in the long run. So, and I suppose when we talk about some of those numbers about pension coverage and what people have thought about, this is basically what the government are trying to deal with.
Yes, and I think the key thing to get across as well to employers, Rob, is that this isn't something that is going to go away. It is something that's coming in, and you can't opt out from it yourself as an employer. It's coming in. No, you cannot. This is set. This is coming. You're going to have to deal with it. It's sick pay. It's other increases in minimum wage depending on your workplace. This is set. It is coming. The date might be a bit sort of Q1-y from the point of view. We're not sure an exact date yet, but it is coming, so we need to be prepared for it. Yeah.
Can I add something to that, Christelle?
Yeah.
Because we're seeing with a lot of our business owner clients that the labour market has gotten very tight, and being part of a pension scheme is kind of a cheap way to enhance pay for employees without paying employers PRSI. So we are seeing a lot of employers setting up pension schemes anyway, regardless of this program, just to try and attract talent and keep good employees without having to give them a pay rise, which obviously attracts employers PRSI. So we are seeing employers in the current job market anyway being attracted to this benefit anyway. So I think it is going to be an extra cost for every employer, but we are seeing some voluntarily doing this anyway. People moving towards it.
Well, actually, that's we have a question here, Dave, that might cover this anyway. Is if there is already a private pension scheme in place, or you're looking to put one in within the company, is the employee eligible for the government contribution if it's a private pension scheme?
Yeah, so if there's already an occupational company pension scheme in place, they don't need to sign up to the auto-enrolment scheme. But that's only for employees who are members of the scheme. So if your employees are a member of your group PRSA or your master trust or whatever it is, then you don't need to worry about this. The government contribution won't apply because you'll be getting tax relief. So a standard rate taxpayer will be getting 20% relief, a top rate taxpayer 40%. So the top rate taxpayer would be getting more of a government contribution than the auto-enrolment scheme anyway, to be better off. So that's what we are seeing, a lot of people coming to us saying, well, maybe if we have to do this anyway, maybe we'll just take control and set up our own scheme if they haven't already, for those reasons, particularly for the company directors and the higher earners who would be much better off in a private scheme than this scheme.
Yeah, and that's actually, I have a question here, and maybe it's a little bit specific, so they might contact you separately, but I currently pay a lot more to my pension than my employer. My employer only pays 2%.
Yeah.
Would I be better off cancelling my current pension and starting this one, as I'm losing out then as the pension builds over time? I suppose
Well,
it depends
2%,
on how much they're paying, yeah.
Yeah, 2% is better than 1.5% for now, and depending on what tax band they're on, they're probably getting more tax relief themselves if they're making a decent size contribution. So we'd have to look at it and run the numbers, but I imagine they're okay for now. This this isn't coming in anytime soon. This is not going to happen early 2025. They haven't appointed investment managers, or any of the Tata have only really gotten started. So people have time to think about this and get organised.
Yeah, and I think as well, I know there's a couple of people I've spoken to, David and Rob, happy to get your feedback on this, that they're like, oh, well, we're going to lose out on the 0.5% from the government. But technically, if the individual is putting in 5% and the company's putting in 5%, you're still better off.
Oh, yeah. Like Yeah, the tax relief that you get, while it's kind of slightly invisible and it's a bit like the SSIA program back in the day, the tax relief is a little bit invisible, so you don't feel you're getting a benefit. But it's actually in reality, it's a much better employer or government contribution than the auto-enrolment scheme. Yeah, particularly for top-rate taxpayers, as I said.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to mention, is that you might not be getting the you're not getting a line item saying 0.5% government contribution, but you're getting it from the tax break.
Correct.
Yeah, which is important. So I suppose at this stage, it's kind of like it's a difficult thing to decide on your approach as a company at the moment. But Rob, I suppose from a communication perspective, from a HR perspective, what should companies be doing at the moment in regards to communicating to employers? Because obviously we're still waiting on a lot of information from the government, but it is coming. So should we be communicating at this stage?
Absolutely. The sooner you start talking about this thing, the less the surprise is going to feel later on down the tracks. Like, we do know some of the basics. We know what's coming in. We know the contribution rates. The exact dates, question marks. They have appointed someone to manage it. As David says, the investment fund, the fund managers behind it aren't there yet, so there is work to be done there. But getting people used to this idea now makes an awful lot of sense. Again, it's a bit like telling, I've often used examples like these, tell someone they're redundant tomorrow, panic. Tell someone you're redundant in 12 months, trying to plan, trying to think, trying to kind of sort of get it all together. And that's the same thought process I'd use in this situation as well.
Yeah, I also think, again, I'd love to have your own feedback in regards to from a payroll perspective. We're assuming if you're using Sage or BrightPay or whatever payroll system you're using, they're going to have to do it. So, like, your payroll is going to be updated when the information comes out. So at this stage, I wouldn't be running out to change payroll provider just because the change is coming down the track, right?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to take a little bit of time. I think they're going to have to figure out how the payroll systems and this national sort of system are going to work. So it's going to take a little bit of time for that. So there's no big need to panic on the payroll system just yet. Yeah, it's probably worthwhile talk with them, seeing what they're planning, seeing what they're doing. Are they on top of this thing? Have they some sort of sight on this thing? So if they're getting no answers and they don't know what you're talking about, then perhaps it might be worth talking about other providers. But in general terms, like, I'd be very surprised if any of them didn't know about this thing. They do have difficulties in planning something that there's not, for them, the detail isn't there yet. But certainly they should be in the process of at least saying, right, we will need to make changes, and we will be letting you know as well when they're going to make that change.
Yeah, and I think that's important as well. And I think the same as from the opt-out and the record keeping and all that, it's coming down the track. So just be aware of it, but nothing to kind of specifically do at the moment. The other thing that as we would have done as a company here, and I do think it's important for all companies, is, yes, we don't know the exact date it's coming in, but we have calculated the 1.5% in our projections for next year in terms of financial planning as a company, because whether it comes in Q1 or Q2, there is going to be a cost for you next year as an employer.
Yeah,
which I think is important.
And that's why we've been trying to advise clients for the last while as well. Look, we know what it is. You can begin to plan this. You can build it into your budgets for the following year. And you're going to need to start building it into the budgets for those things down the future as well. There's no point in letting this like looking at sort of how you manage that cost now makes a lot more sense than waiting, say, maybe the end of Q1 into Q2, whenever they actually roll it out. Makes a lot more sense managing and planning for those matters now.
Yeah, we've just included in now. So key times and deadlines, I mean, this is what we kind of know so far. And I would really like to preface this with both David and Rob. I think you guys would 100% agree with this, is that this is what we know so far, but this could all change in a couple of weeks. But I think important for employers and companies to be putting in the budget for January and to communicating to employees that this is coming down the track. So Rob, do you want to just give a rundown of what we know so far in regards to timelines and deadlines?
Yeah, look, they have plans that 2025 will be the rollout date. Now, again, I think myself and David would agree that seems optimistic at best at the moment. But again, as my dad used to always say, hope for the best, plan for the worst. So that sort of thing. After that, then, said every 3 years you'll see increases in those contributions. As I think we mentioned earlier, 1.53, 4.5, 6%. So those increases will be built in. They'll be baked into the system. Once that go date is done, those things are baked in. Now, again, will government change its mind? Who knows? Unlikely, I would suspect, because they'll need to do this. And again, time is ticking against them here. Arguably, all this started being talked about when Britain introduced their own auto-enrolment, and there's been talk about that for the last better part of 10 years in Ireland, and we need this. So I think they're going to have to maintain some of these timelines with this thing fairly strictly. So yeah, I expect, look, one way or another, it's very likely to start next year. It will have to be honest about it. Again, as you say, would I put my house on it? Hell no. But I think there's a big imperative to try and get moving on this thing.
Yes, and I think, Rob, we probably had a similar conversation at the beginning of this year when we were talking about the right to request working from home as well. We were waiting for that for, I'm going to say that for half 6 months.
Yeah, the code's coming. The code's coming. When is it coming? Can you put a deadline on it, for heaven's sake?
Yeah, exactly. In around H1.
Yeah. Ish.
Ish, yeah. So there's a question here for Mark that it's just around the CPA. So, hi, will employers need to record the date of birth for payroll submissions when auto-enrolment starts? I.e., if auto-enrolment only applies to a certain date range, will the pension administrators have to have the age details from the employers or from some other source? Again, Rob, David, correct me if I'm wrong here, but if it's going to be coming directly from the POE, kind of the government, they already know your date of birth, so you're not going to have to I suppose, manage that. And David, when you're managing a pension fund, when people sign up, you know all the information from people anyway. So it's not going to be the employers who are going to have to manage all that.
No, but I suppose you're only automatically enrolled if you're between 23 and 60. So it's just to keep an eye on that if you have young employees or older employees. Yeah.
No, that's a good point. So I suppose this is, David, where you're going to, because there's a number of questions here that are all really about how does this affect your current pension scheme. And so I suppose if you want to, will I ask the questions and maybe we can go.
Yeah, there's some good questions in there. All right, yeah.
So if they have their own private, not PRSA pension scheme, can they opt out from the beginning, or do they have to wait the 6 months?
They can opt out, but they'd be giving up an employer contribution, I guess. So it's the only people that don't need to enroll at all are people who are already members of an occupational company pension scheme or a PRSA where there's an employer contribution. But anyone else can opt out if they want. But would they want to give up the 1.5%? It depends on their tax band, I guess. It's probably different for every individual in a way, depending on their financial plan. But yeah.
Can you opt out even if you don't have it? So I think at the moment the rules are after 6 months, so you will be opted in for the first 6 to 8 months, and then you can opt out.
Yeah.
That's what for the moment. So yeah, I suppose if you want to go through, so David, if companies already have a pension scheme in place, how does this affect it, or does it affect it at all?
Yeah, so if there's any kind of an occupational scheme, payroll deduction scheme in place, they're exempt from this and they can carry on as per normal. So we're seeing a flurry of people trying to get these group PRSAs and master trusts set up in advance of this so that they can keep control, and that can be more expensive in terms of getting the scheme set up and the requirement on an employer contribution. But if the employer is intending paying more than 1.5% anyway, then that's probably a better way to go. We don't really know how this new scheme is going to be managed and invested. That's the big concern. Colin Fagan wrote a very good piece and submitted it to the government about the flaws of the investment model for this scheme, and that's maybe part of the reason for the delay. So I think a lot of people would prefer to carry on with their existing scheme than be involved with this, but that's a matter of debate.
Yeah. So David, if somebody currently has their own pension scheme, it continues as usual. More than likely, most companies that I've seen, which I said already, is that most people wouldn't be eligible for the pension scheme for the first 6 months until they pass their probation period. So technically, if I'm hiring somebody next year, in theory, when it comes through, they'll be auto-enrolled into the government pension scheme and then perhaps come into the company's pension scheme after 6 months. Or at this stage, would you be saying to people, just put people into the pension scheme on day one?
Oh, I really think it would get very messy for payroll and reconciliation if you have some employees in the auto-enrollment scheme and some in a private pension scheme. I think it depends on how organised your payroll and financial control departments are, but I don't think many employers want to have that situation. I think it's one or the other. And my recommendation is that you go one or the other.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense just from a logistics perspective.
The reconciliation would be horrendous.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're going to have to explain to the employee why you're moving from one to the other, and they might necessarily not understand or not want to, and it just gets.
We think we might see is for SMEs that the company directors would continue on with a master trust or some scheme like that, and maybe they'd have all the employees in the auto-enrollment scheme. We have seen that in certain cases, but
okay. And in these private ones, David, if the employee doesn't contribute to the scheme, what happens? Okay, so if they're only getting the employer contribution?
Yeah, so that is possible. Most employers would have some sort of matching arrangement that they won't pay into it unless the employee pays into it. So they'll match contributions up to, say, 5%, typically is what we see. So the employee would take up that offer because they'd be giving up 5% tax-free pay rise effectively. So it'd be rare enough for us to see a scheme where the employer is contributing and they don't require the employee to match it or make some payment in. That'd be very generous on an employer's part.
I would agree. Yeah, if someone joins a PRSA with no employer contributions and it's deducted from wages, can they also be part of the auto-enrollment pension? No, it's either one or the other, right?
Yeah.
Yep. If you run internship programs and you pay your interns, do you need to contribute for them? I suppose if they fall within the threshold.
Can I just come back on that point, just to clarify, because it will be possible to be in the auto-enrollment scheme and have what's called an AVC PRSA running alongside. If the employee can only put 1.5% into the auto-enrollment scheme. So if they want to do more, they have to do it themselves separately into what's called an additional voluntary contribution PRSA, that is the case as it stands at the moment as well. It's the same thing. A lot of public sector workers would use that. So they can have their own personal PRSA running alongside the auto-enrollment scheme for AVCs.
And so, David, at this stage, would you just be recommending, exactly like I said there to Rob, is that if you have a personal pension scheme, if you have a pension scheme in place as a company, you obviously have to offer your PRSA, that you're sitting down with employees, with somebody like yourself or whoever is managing the PRSA, and going through what their options, what their options are, what they want to do, what does it look like for them at this stage, or wait until January, February?
Yeah, it's a big strategic decision for senior management to decide what way do they want to go, and it's not an easy decision because there's going to be cost either way, and how easy are they finding it to attract and keep talent? There's a lot of moving parts in this decision. The easy route is just to ignore a private pension scheme and just go straight into auto-enrollment and be cheap and easily managed, and hopefully if they ever get figured out, the payroll and deductions will be smooth. That is definitely the easy route, but it's less advantageous for some employees, particularly higher earning employees. So yeah, it's a big strategic decision. It's going to take some time to run through it and as a business decide which way you want to go.
There's a couple of questions here about the providers, and I'm wondering, David or Rob, if either of you knows, is there any information even in broad terms about the investment options that will be available within the scheme and who's managing it? I know you spoke about it's the guys who are doing the UK one, but I know for myself, and I'm not going to lie, my eyes glaze over every time I meet my pension provider, and he goes,
I'm very disappointed, Christelle.
I'm sorry.
This is exciting stuff we're talking about here.
And he goes through the different areas that it's invested in, and I say, that's fantastic. And he asks me, do I want to change anything? And I go, whatever you think now, that's great.
Yeah.
I presume we're not going to get that much detail from the government one.
So the Tata consultancy have been hired to run the scheme and organize, get things up and running and build the structure, but they're going to appoint 4 investment managers. But we don't know who they are. They haven't appointed them yet. I'm assuming at least some of them will be Irish. The likes of Zurich or Irish Life would be hot contenders for that. Maybe Mercer will have some say in it as well. I don't know. We don't know anything about that yet.
And that's, I suppose, it depends on how much control you want to have on your pension scheme, your pension as well, in terms of personally, I suppose, if you're happy. I wonder, Rob, you've obviously dealt with lots of employees over the years in regards to, is this just very much aimed at that younger cohort who really just going to be a Netflix subscription that's going to come out? They never would have done a pension anyway. They don't have any interest in doing a pension, and it's really just making them do it.
It is. That's the essence of it, and it's just trying to force you into planning. And look, it's like your parents would have been telling you for years. Make sure you put money away for that rainy day. This is the rainy day they're talking about in part. And as you say, it's getting people used to it. And I suppose that's why you can't opt out initially. You can't have an automatic opt out day one unless there's a company pension scheme in place. So that's why they want you in, and hopefully then you're not really noticing 1% or 1.5%, that you're just chugging along. You're getting used to it, and then as it continues to increase, then you're just thinking, look, it's fine. I'll keep going with it. Job done.
Exactly, and you kind of forget about it. I think, David, you've asked this, but you've answered this already, but you will answer this in a far more eloquent way than myself. Is if I go with the auto-enrolment and I want to contribute more, can I do this? So technically no, but you can have that PRSA.
Yeah.
Be, as I said, be beside it.
Exactly. It has to be an AVC PRSA linked to the employment. It can't be a normal PRSA you already have in place for your own personal use. Okay. The subtle difference.
Yeah, and I suppose, and that's why I think at this stage, David, I think you'll agree, is from a company perspective, what I've been saying to people is get in contact with whoever's providing with your pension and sit down and ask them what would it look like if we put everybody into the company scheme? What would it look like if we sat down with everybody and made them do the PRSA on day one, or what would that look like as a company? What would the costs be? What would the cost benefit be for employees? Because you said something there that I suppose haven't been able to articulate properly, but you've said it really well, is that we do not see the government 0.5% contribution on a line item, but you do see it in regards to your tax relief. So you're not actually losing out. Yeah. So your advice for employers, David, at the moment would be to sit down with their pension providers or get a pension provider and just have a chat with them.
Yeah, and then just run the numbers and weigh it up. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is definitely the so that's exactly. So if you want to maybe go through, David, the couple of alternatives to if companies have nothing in place other than just the PRSA, the what they have to provide, the option for a PRSA, if I was coming to you today, what would you be telling me to do?
So, like, broadly speaking, there's 2 options. There's a master trust, which is like the old traditional company pension scheme, which has been around a long time. You set up a scheme with Mercer or Zurich or whoever it is, and there's employer and employee contributions, and there's a reconciliation every month, and it gets invested into some class of an investment strategy, and it's well-worn path. There's trustees So usually the senior management of the company will be the trustees, or you can hire external trustees to just keep an eye on governance and management and make sure contributions are being invested on time and that nobody's taking excess risk or anything like that. And that's the traditional company pension scheme. More recently, the government have been pushing employers to use a PRSA, which is a personal retirement savings account, which was originally set up by Charlie McCreevy just to encourage small starter pensions, but it's now become a big monster of a pension strategy, and that can be set up in a group structure, so you have a direct debit or a standing order going into the PRSA provider for everyone. But they are more portable. Each individual can bring their own PRSA with them to another employment, and they have their pros and cons. The fees are very set and fixed and transparent, and the investment strategies are probably a little bit less open than the occupational scheme or the master trust, but they're portable and highly regulated. So it's kind of between the two of them as to which an employer would like to go with. You mentioned in the list there defined benefit pension, but I don't know of any company that's set up a DB scheme in the last 20 years. Most of them are closing down. If you're an employee here and your employer is saying they want to set up a DB scheme, take their arm off.
Absolutely.
Run. Yeah, and don't let them say no. But
no, get that agreed that day. Don't get back into a second day. That's day one agreement.
They are the fat cat gold plated pensions everyone talks about.
Yeah, I actually had a friend recently who was being made redundant, and she was talking about the redundancy package, and then when she said she had a defined benefit, I was like, now that's actually that's your issue.
Yeah.
That's what you need to be looking at. We all want one of those.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is, because there's so many questions, and I'm going to just fire them out, and Rob, Dave, if you maybe want to just shout. So for foreign employees who will retire overseas, will they still receive the pension entitlement if non-resident?
Interesting question. I suspect that if the scheme is set up and they have contributions to it, they'll have to decide what they want to do with themselves. Like again, it mirrors an element of the PRSA where it's your pension scheme. Yeah. So if you want to transfer it, if you want to keep it in Ireland, if you want to transfer it, I'm like David can talk better about what happens in those scenarios, but I'm presuming that it's yours, so make a decision.
Yeah, just add to Rob's comments there and say this is a really tricky one at the moment because the Irish revenue won't pay out pension income gross. So if you're non-resident and you've moved somewhere else, you will be looking to get the pension paid gross and pay your tax in your local jurisdiction. But at the moment, the revenue won't pay these things gross, or you have to put up a big fight to get it paid. So you'll pay Irish tax on it and then try and claim it back, and it's really difficult. So the question is whether they'll allow your benefits in the auto-enrolment scheme to be transferred pre-retirement to an offshore scheme, which is allowed under EU rules, but that needs a lot of advice, that one, particularly if the fund becomes reasonably large, because it might be a benefit to move the whole scheme before you retire.
Yeah, and that's I think when those specific ones come in, it's going to speak to somebody like yourself, David, to figure out your own financial planning. If an employee is 58 years old, would it be worthwhile for them to opt in?
David,
go ahead, Rob.
No, I suppose it depends on what you're on at the moment, and I think David was saying this very much earlier, that if the scheme you have at the moment is a better benefit, then stay with it. If there's benefit to you moving over, then again, but that might be a circumstance of getting good sound financial advice.
Like, it's free money, and it's not a huge contribution. So if they've no pension benefits, and why not do it for a few years? Because they have to pay 1.5%, but they get another 2% on top of that. So it's that's a pay rise effectively.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, Rob and Dave, to your point, is that it depends on how much they're currently putting in. So in terms of wage bracket, if a company has a private scheme, will it have to increase alongside the auto-enrolment increase? For example, will it have to go to 6% contribution?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that's
answer.
That's a simple answer. but very good point to put in, that's where we need to start be looking at our own company budgets. That if, for example, if you're looking for the next 5 years, if you're that organized that you're 5-year planning, that within the budget you need to be putting in your 1.5% contribution now, then going up to 3%, then going up to 4.5%, then going up to 6% over the next couple of years, right? And like you said, Rob, plan for the worst, and it might not go that fast, but which is important. Okay, what happens in dual employments? Which employer pays the 1%? Oh, I don't know. Can companies implement the auto-enrollment and discontinue the more advantageous? Oh, then that's 2 questions. So first question, what happens in dual employments? Which employer pays the 1%?
That's going to be a bit of an interesting one. I suppose the threshold is 20 grand, and the implication is, and again, this requires more knowledge that we have probably. The implication is that if it's over that 20 grand with both employers, then you'll be auto-enrolled. What will happen then? That part is a little bit more hard to answer. I suspect it may well be a proportionate answer. But I suppose in essence, if you're putting in 15,000 and the other employer is putting in 7,000, or at least they're paying you that, excuse me, it's 1.5% of what you're putting in and 1.5% what the other employer is putting in. So it's an interesting question. David might have a better answer than I in that one, but that's my understanding at the moment.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Rob. We don't know for sure, but if you're over 20 grand on both, I imagine you'll be enrolled in both. Whether you can opt out of one or not, we don't know.
Yeah, okay, so one to come back to. If you have a private company scheme in place, will the company still have to pay a contribution of 1.5 if your employees don't sign up for auto-enrollment? I don't think so. So if the company's not matching, so if the company's not putting any contribution in, but you're still paying 5%.
Yeah, I think there will have to be an employer contribution into the scheme for you to be able to dodge the auto-enrollment.
Yeah. Okay, so interesting. So again, back to that, regardless, companies need to budget for the 1.5%. Okay, I think that's answered. Is it possible that the government will appoint maybe an NTMA managed fund as one of the investment options, making it a government scheme?
Yeah, I think that's what we'd like to see happening, but the politics of it and the lobbying, we don't know. They're going to appoint 4 fund managers, we believe. I think ideally you'd like to see it managed centrally where the fees would be kept really low and it'd be very efficient, and the NTMA having a say in that, but we don't know who they're going to appoint yet.
And I think we're going to have the same answer to this as a we don't know. Is any special conditions in the scheme for recruitment agencies who have temporary workers with various companies? So again, I suppose that's that other question. If the employee is getting to over the threshold, but maybe with 3 or 4 different employers, who's paying? And that hasn't really been clarified yet.
It's a really interesting question. I suppose this is the detail that we still are waiting on. So I suspect that again, within that 6 months they're meant to join, you're meant to put it in. So again, for a recruitment agency, you're going to have to factor into your costs and what you're charging your clients. So again, this is where that bit of planning up front makes a big difference.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of advice for employers and employees, so I'm going to whistle stop tour this because I'm just conscious of time. But Rob and David, if you just kind of maybe have a think afterwards, you can roll in after me. So number one thing I would say is for employer preparation. So start your discussions now. Reach out to your pension providers if you have one. If not, just reach out. There's no commitment to reaching out to David, having a discussion, and seeing what it would look like, what the costs would be. I would certainly agree with what Rob was saying in terms of start the communication to your employees now. I think the worst thing that you can do is all of a sudden jump something onto employees, because sometimes they feel like that the company is taking the money away from them. So be very clear, and sometimes that can be that somebody can come in and talk to your employees about exactly what's happening.
Yeah, just a quick word, and you're absolutely right. And we do see something like this in the construction industry, which is covered by sector employment orders that do have things like pensions built into them. And sometimes new employees, when they're put into the scheme, can get a little bit frustrated. Hang on, I'm having to put money into this. So again, the quicker and the smoother you make that path for yourself, the easier it becomes later on.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with over communicating, I think is important. Seek expert advice, and that's where I think the likes of yourself, Dave, Rob, come in that if those specific questions about, like, if it's somebody who's abroad, if overseas, if it's multiple employments, if you've got a couple of different pension schemes, things like that. Start to seek expert advice from your pension provider, from advisors, I think is important. And then stay informed. Unfortunately, we do not have all the information here. And again, not to compare to the code of practice, the code for requesting your flexible working. Hopefully, we will know more. It's supposed to come in the 1st of January. David, Rob, I would agree with you that if it comes in the 1st of January, it'll be quite the miracle.
I think they've already admitted it's not going to be the 1st of January now. It's second half of the year at the earliest is my gut instinct.
Yeah, but just for companies that it's important to be planning for it.
Definitely, yeah.
Dave, would you add anything else into there for companies to be doing at this stage?
No, like no more than I said earlier. Just need to sit down and have a big strategic think about future pension arrangements for the business and decide which way they want to go, and run the numbers as accurately as you can and make a decision before this comes in, so you're taking control. Yeah.
Rob, anything from your side that you think?
Yeah, look, it's the same thing, I suppose. Look, again, just to over communicate. Again, keep talking to your staff, let them know what's going on. No, you don't have all the answers yet, but again, let them know that this is coming down the tracks. You're going to have to implement it. It's not necessarily something you have a whole lot of control over where you go for the auto-enrollment scheme. But again, I think as David's saying there, look at your options. Really, really clear as an employer. What's your options for now? And again, I think David mentioned as well, like a lot of employers are using this now as a differentiator when it comes to, trying to hire new people. So look at all of that thing. Look at the sector you're in, see what options, see what's the best one for you, what makes the most sense, what makes you feel the most comfortable, and then sort of see if that's the one to go for you. But again, you need to, I'd be suggesting, I don't know anywhere near enough about pensions, but I think David and colleagues like him would be definitely people to talk to about that.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree. And I also think that I remember giving the same advice when we were talking about remote working and waiting for the kind of all the legislation to come in, is that you can't wait for it to come and just be put in front of you. You need to decide as a company. Dave, to your point, is are you getting 5%? Is that your differentiator? Because now you need to be making that decision. You don't, and so have a look at your options now. Don't just kind of passively wait for the information. So I think we're up on time now. Thank you very much for both yourself, David and Rob, for coming on. We'll send on all the information later on this afternoon from the webinar and the slides and hopefully all your questions as well. Dave, Rob, the best way for people to get in contact with you is maybe to reach out to on LinkedIn if they have any specific questions or want to set up some time to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Easiest for me anyway.
Yeah, investwise.ie if you want to get my contact details online, or shoot me a line on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and hopefully that somewhat answered some questions. Sometimes they pose a little bit more questions afterwards as well, but definitely to get ahead of it. And so thank you so much for taking the time, everybody, and we'll talk to you all soon. So take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.